This is International Master Eric Kislik. Today I'm going to cover Game 2 of the Liren versus Gukesh World Championship match. We'll get to all the games. I know there was another game today. Obviously, planning to cover that, but I'll get to that tomorrow. Just doing it in order so we get to cover everything. But mainly just want to talk about what both sides are trying to do, what both sides are trying to achieve from the opening, and just kind of share my impressions. Do I think they did a really good job, a decent job of preparation? Did something go wrong? Did the moves have a purpose? Because a lot of the time, you'll even hear people, sometimes even 2200, 2300 players who will say stuff like, I should have gone for the Rai Lopez. But of course, nowadays, people will say, yeah, well, there's the Berlin, there's the Marshall. You might be going into 30 moves of prep and just have a draw. So, I thought it was interesting what Liren did in this game. He played e4. He hasn't done that much of e4, but was very interesting to see him play it because he is a very tactical player. So, if you give him a chance to get an attack, he'll be very, very dangerous. He's one of the most aggressive d4 players himself, one of the most tactical d4 players, so just interesting to see how he plays e4. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d3, knight f6. Yeah, the main move here is c3. A lot of people consider c3 the most accurate move. I'd say the main thing that knight c3 does is makes you come up with some kind of solution to bishop g5 and also knight d5 plus c3. So Ding plays knight c3 here. Yeah, I'll just show you a sample line after c3. Kind of main line, castle, castle, d3, d6, h3, h6. One of my students very often plays h6 with black in Italian game and Rai Lopez positions where they play d3, and very rarely does it end up actually being a bad move. Because here's the thing, one of the ways white would often exploit that would be something like g4, g5, or a really quick d4, but it's just very hard to get either of those here. So, rook e1, a6, typical move, can tuck in the bishop, a4, bishop a7. Yeah, very common plan here, just, rook e8, bishop e6, very typical. A lot of the time people just go bishop e6 right away. Doesn't matter if you have the doubled pawns, They take, typical stuff like this, knight h5, knight f4. So all that stuff is very common. All right, knight c3, which I thought was a very interesting choice by Ding, especially if he wants to play safely and just sort of see what his opponent's going to do. I don't think he expected this, but he might have been thinking to himself, hey, well, maybe my opponent will take some kind of huge risk in a very calm position. And he didn't, but it was interesting to just see what Gukesh would do. a6, Gukesh secures his bishop, allowing it to be tucked in on a7. a4, white links knight d5 and bishop g5 plans, which black has to respond to. d6, okay. So this has ideas like bishop g4 or bishop to e6. Bishop g4 would threaten to go knight to d4, kind of like white's idea of bishop g5 threatens to go knight d5. A lot of potential symmetry here. It's basically making the argument that including a4 is a little bit better than including a6, especially if you give me an extra tempo. So castles, h6. h6 has Gukesh looking like a prophylaxis king against Ding. Yep, just a good solid move. Very typical, like I said, for the way one of my students likes to play. Just in general, in these types of positions, he likes to play h6. And, if white plays h3, white may be creating a hook for g5, so white doesn't want to do that. So bishop b3, interesting move. Interesting move. White needs to challenge the c5 bishop, so Ding does so very early in the game. And there are a lot of ways that this can play out. For example, if people take, white will often go queen e1, knight h4, knight f5, stuff like that. So there's really no need to take. A lot of people just go for the symmetry, bishop e6. So a5, this space-gaining move has the provocative idea of tempting black to go after the pawn. Yeah, what was interesting is I did see some analysis on this game, just kind of, I decided to look at what a couple of other people had analyzed just out of curiosity, like, oh, did people analyze going after the pawn? And there were some people who didn't even look at it. But the very first thing I thought was, well, could I try to go after that pawn? I'll just show a typical move that could have been played. So let's say knight d5. Take, castles, take. I mean, knight d4 looks like a good double attack. It doesn't really do anything, though. Yeah, the doubled pawns are not really weak. So we just get something like this, basically equal. Rook f8, yeah. It's basically equal. So we can just go here and c5. That's basically equal position. So nothing wrong with that. Like I was saying, just an equal position there. Very sound. All right, so a5, super interesting choice. Bishop takes c4 was played. I said deep analysis is needed here on the very tempting bishop b4. As black, I would have been tempted to go after the a5 pawn if I did not see any serious reason to not take it. So bishop to b4, going after the pawn. Knight to d5. Bishop takes, and you know, from the black perspective, you might be thinking, well, what's the justification of this? How are they going to try to get the pawn back? The key move is indeed to play d4 to play for time. Now, here's a very interesting point. If they take, and then this move is annoying because I've undefended the piece and now I'm threatening to go here. So that's why they have to play this. And then after rook a3, white is indeed better here. White is indeed better here. Lots of potential things to attack. Queen h5 as a threat, so white's definitely better there. So instead of doing that, this is the move to play. And, you know, it's interesting to look at this. Queen e2, trying to get this pawn back this way. Knight g5, another good move, also opening up the h-file. Take. Now, once again, I saw some GM analysis here. And you know what I think happens here? And this isn't any disrespect to anybody else. What I think happens here is that there's so many games, and you want to get your analysis out right away. And so I think even when really strong GMs, 2700s, 2800s, I mean, I didn't see Carlsen's analysis on this or anything. My guess is that it's mostly just his intuitive thoughts. He probably does a little bit of computer analysis, but nothing too special. But I didn't see anybody cover this rook h4 move, which was my idea. I thought that was the most interesting move. Now I go here. Quite an interesting idea. Take, bringing the queen out. Rook fd1, queen e5. I just thought this was a really cool idea to play with black. Like really aggressive to bring the rook all the way out here. Take, check, take. And then I can take here on e3. Take, check. And then I go knight c5. Take and knight c5. Yeah, I think that's very playable for black here. 2-4-5, 2-4-6. Yeah, that looks very, very playable. So anyway, the other line. This was the line that I saw some GM analysis on. But you know, the funny part, they were saying white was better. But again, you just kind of go deeper, and it's sort of like, well, the burden of proof is on white here, so. Can white actually prove something here? Most of the time, it's very hard to actually prove anything real. So their analysis followed mine. I play this. There's that fork on e7, can't allow it. So I go b5. Take. But the key here is there's so much simplification here. Plus, black is going to put the rook on the the b file here. So I go take, and here. Now, I get it that it looks like there are a bunch of targets, but remember, we always go back to the Mikhail Tal quote, you can only capture one piece at a time. You can only capture one pawn at a time. So, I mean, okay, theoretically, you could take something with check, have a double attack, and win something else, but under normal circumstances, yeah, it's one piece at a time under normal circumstances. So, you know, I was analyzing this, trying to find something compelling for white, but it's just not much. It's really nothing here. So there was a GM saying plus equal here, but it's really not. This is not plus equal. You really just can't prove anything here with white. I mean, it's too bad because it looked like something good was happening. But yeah, black has 2 isolated pawns. They're really not weak, so basically equal. Now, still a very interesting idea to play with white, though. I mean, because that move might throw them off a little bit, that d4 move. It's like, oh, well, now I'm threatening to take and play d5, so they have to react to it. And it's kind of unexpected how, oh, they take on d4, suddenly a piece comes to d4, there's a lot more pressure. Okay, let's go back. a5, bishop takes, pawn takes. I said bishop b4 would have led to extremely exciting play. One has to wonder if Ding had planned an ideal bailout in that line. Yeah, I mean, there are different ways to play, like, for example, take, like something like this. It's very solid, very sound. But in the bishop e4 line I was looking at, knight to d5. Now, I will tell you, from a human perspective, I was looking at this and I was like, am I getting enough for the pawn here? This looks kind of suspicious. But the key idea, which, I mean, I admit is a pretty amazing idea, take queen d3, and then to come here and then go for this. And I saw this engine suggestion and I said, oh, that is kind of nice. But the other cool thing is, if you've seen this kind of thing in analysis, I might think to myself, hey, you know what? If I ever play the white side of this kind of a line, I could maybe use that idea. Queen d3, queen f5, queen g4, try to swing into the square. So I go queen f5. Also keep in mind, I do have this threat. I do have the c3 threat, so I am forcing something here. Knight e6, queen g4. I said white's primary idea involves the sacrifice of 2 pawns. With this in mind, Ding's opening concept was very radical and possibly part of a bluff. Yeah, so I analyzed taking the pawn. The funny thing is, if you put this into the computer, it will often tell you to not take the pawns. But of course, obviously, from a human perspective, you have to look at these moves. And it's also what I call the mom principle, the most obvious move principle. In your analysis, you need to look at all the obvious human moves. Otherwise, I mean, if you're just putting in random computer moves, it's not all that useful past a certain point. Because really, the point of all the analysis that you do with computers is to make sure you're actually understanding what you're looking at. So that's the whole purpose of it all. All right, so bishop b4, knight f5, g6. I mean, kind of a funny line. It's like 2 pawns down. And I was analyzing this with the computer, and I thought to myself, yeah, that's pretty wild. That Ding may have prepared something like this before the game, like king d7, another very fascinating move. Also, I have a funny move after this. I have the switchback going back. Take, b4, queen f3, and now I have the switchback, king to e8, trying to go king f8. I mean, that's so wild. That's such a wild way to play. Now, I'm trying to bail out with white. I mean, what's so crazy about this variation? Like, this is why I was wondering, what exactly did Ding prepare here? Because I had to, do some computer analysis on this line to fully convince myself, okay, now I have the c3 idea with the knight e6 check idea. But yeah, I was looking at this and I was going, wow, this is pretty wild. Okay, now I do have more tactical ideas that can't really move the knight because of rook takes f5. Take. Okay, so now I'm only down 1 pawn. That's a big step up, and now I'm getting that pawn. Okay, so now it's equal. But, I mean, do you see how many moves ahead we are? I mean, this is move 36. The sacrifice is occurring on move 10. So, honestly, if you're playing black in a real game, I mean, assuming you're not playing a world championship match, which you probably won't be if you're watching this video, you look at something like this and you go, yeah, well, I think I can take the 2 pawn. I mean, it's kind of like what Korchnoi said about taking material. He's like, look, if you're defending and you see a pawn and you don't see any refutation for taking the pawn, you might as well have a pawn for your suffering. And if you're not suffering, again, put the burden of proof on the opponent. If you really can't see any reason why they gave up a pawn, take it. Now, this is an interesting line because in this line, there's no actual d4. So, I mean, here we are giving up the 2 pawns, and we have to find this. I mean, think about the difficulty in finding this maneuver. I mean, you have to find this maneuver, boop, 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 and then this and this. I mean, that's pretty deep. That's pretty deep as a concept. Now, the cool part is you see concepts like this, and then it gives you more of a repertoire to use, in the future for sacrificing material. And, the funny part is there are a bunch of videos on this game. I don't think anyone went deep into the sacrifices, which was probably the most interesting moment of the game, to be honest, because, sacrificing 1 or 2 pawns, you can't just willy-nilly just give up those pawns. So I will say one thing that I've adapted, since I was maybe, let's say from when I was a 2000 player to an international master. There were times when I would prepare some line where you give up a pawn and I would go, oh yeah, I'll figure it out. I never do that now. Anytime I sacrifice a pawn in analysis, I always want to know exactly what am I getting for that pawn. And in this line, I mean, it's it's a little bit hard to verbalize. It's like, well, we get a lead in development. We put our knights on d5 and f5. We might have f4 as a break. I mean, you see, I'm already verbalizing it a lot. So what you should do is if you have an opening file on a line like this, you have as much verbal explanation as possible to help you kind of understand this sort of stuff. All right, so he did not go after the pawn. Castles was played. Bishop takes. Pawn takes b3. Very safe move. Yeah, I mean, interesting move. I mean, one idea here is just to take and then go knight e1 and knight d3. That's a typical move. This is also an interesting move to keep the queens on. Like let's say knight d4, knight d5, and then I go c3. Like black wins c6, I go c3. Okay, just playing mirrored strategies. I mirror again, kind of funny. Yeah, let's say I play this. By the way, nice little trick. If they take, I have knight g5, hitting the e4 pawn, so you got to be careful about that. So this rook bd8, king f1, take. Yeah, I mean, I do think this is about equal, but still would have been an interesting try. I mean, again, there will be a lot of stuff like this in a match of this nature where the computer will give it 0.1, 0.2, even if you let it run for 2 hours and get to depth 50 or whatever. You'll have some very small positional edge. But I would say from a practical perspective, you want to play where you think that your most dangerous idea is the most clear and easy to play. So he played b3. I like that. Queen takes d1. Gukesh decides to simplify as a tool for equalization. In my second book, Chess Logic and Practice, there was a chapter, Simplification as a Tool for Equalization. Exchanges on the d-file take him closer to a drawn knight endgame when a5 is potentially an issue. Rook takes d1. He played rook a8. I said that rook fd8 felt more natural, clearing the way for king f8, but this move is still solid enough. Yeah, I mean, like after that move, I don't really have that many options. I guess I would just do this and go knight d5. Yeah, but no major threat. King f1, king f8. No major threat, really. No major threat. Yeah, I was just analyzing some moves here. Rook d3, knight g8, and knight e7. King e2, knight e7. Yeah, the problem for white is no real threat. The problem for white is that there's no real threat here. Looks about equal. So, rook a8 was fine. Rook a8 was totally fine. Yeah, rook dc1. There was also a lot of analysis I saw on this where no one even commented on the move, and I was thinking to myself, well, that is kind of important because you could play knight e1 right away. Now here's the interesting part of knight e1. It does sack the a5 pawn. I think he was probably afraid to give up that pawn. He probably hadn't analyzed that, so he wasn't sure. But I go knight d3. I have the double attack. Of course, they can defend it this way, but then I have this move. And so it's quite possible, by the way, you got to be careful if you play c6 because that knight might be trapped. So you got to be super careful with how this is played. So, yeah, I was analyzing knight c6. Knight c1, got that pin on the file. Go c3 after that. Yeah, it's a pretty... I mean, basically, it looks a little passive, but everything's guarded. Everything's guarded. Yeah, I said white's a little bit better here. I mean, that might even be a stretch, but white's a little bit better here. I've played the same structure with white in a tournament game where they had the doubled pawns here, and I went for the f4 plan. I also had a grandmaster, the guy who's organizing this world championship match, play a very similar plan against me, but even more potent on the king side. So yeah, Grandmaster Kevin Go, very dangerous player. Glad I'm not playing him. All right, so I analyzed this move, just kind of flexing what black is able to do, and then king f8, and then g6. I'm just trying to control the squares here. King f1, king e7. Notice still no real threat. Still no real threat here. King e2, king d6. Got a little cool move here. b4, b5. Nice move. Nice move, because that pawn defends the knight. So there's nothing there. But yeah, I mean, that's not that easy to see. So I think knight e1, from a practical perspective, would have been the most interesting move. Would have been the most threatening move. White could have potentially maybe gotten something. This just struck me as a little bit slow. I know he was trying to be safe. So knight d4, of course, he wants to take on f3. Knight e1. Ding secures c2 and frees the f pawn to defend e4. Yeah, he might just play f3. Rook d6, good rook lift. Good rook lift. When half of your pieces are rooks, you might as well look for rook lifts. Tends to be a useful way to give them targets to attack. King f1. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking for this move. I'm looking for that move. So trying to get in g4. Knight d3, rook b2, and the problem is that move. The problem is that knight takes c2 move, undermining the defense of the knight. But I can take there though. Knight f4. No, they can't take because, well, no, they can't take because of e5. I was trying to calculate that really quickly, like knight takes a5, e5, and then if rook d4, maybe knight fe2 with a double attack. So take, rook e1. Yeah, another interesting line, but seems to be equal here. So king f1, that's what was played by Ding. G6 was played. Yeah, I mean, here's the interesting thing. The computer says it's all okay, but from a human perspective, I still thought g5 was just the more aggressive move. I mean, maybe he could have scared Ding a little bit more if he had done this, and you play g4, you play h5, you gain a little more space, you go here, maybe go knight h5. This could give your opponent more of a scare. But then again, maybe he was afraid of his own scare. So, something like this. Yeah, I mean, this was a really interesting line that I was analyzing here. I mean, super, super messy. So, yeah, I think that if this had been played by Gukesh, he would have gotten better winning chances than the game continuation. Yeah, and he played rook d1. He was just trying to keep it safe. I mean, this is also an interesting move. f3 and then play b4. And you don't have to try to take. You could just play b5. Because, if you take, then you isolate these three pawns. So b5 may actually be more interesting. But yeah, I mean, I do think that there was an argument that maybe Ding was a little bit afraid of weakening his king potentially. Take, rook b7, take, h3, stuff like this. All kinds of, it's possible he was worried about things like this. I mean, like this line that I'm showing here, which is kind of crazy. I mean, white is up 2 pawns in this line, so this is a wild position. So that, I think, was the wildest line that could have occurred, after he didn't play g5. But yeah, if you think about it, I mean, what am I trying to do as black here? Well, there's that f5 break in the line I just showed, but there was also the g5, g4 move, which basically forces open lines. So rook d1, safe move. Yeah, I mean, again, it depends what you want to do as black. I like this h5, h4 plan. Knight d7, defending those 2 pawns, c5, e5, rook c8. Yeah, I mean, this was very playable. This was very playable. It does isolate his pawn, but yes, now I have this combination. Knight takes c5 and rook takes d4. Take, rook d5. take, g5. Yeah, I mean, white's up a pawn, but you look at the structure and you're kind of thinking, yeah, okay. I mean, you're very unlikely to turn that into a very strong pass pawn, so that's about equal. All right, so f3, white secures the e4 pawn and prepares king f2. King g7, good move. King f2, I said rook to d2 can come next, consolidating and preparing to kick the knight out of d4. Yeah, I mean, this is always an interesting choice, but you know, h5, h4, knight c6. The problem in this line, if I do this, is that yeah, I do have to give up that pawn. c4, b6, take. And you know, it might look like you get something, but f5 comes in so fast. And here I can sack the exchange. Take, knight e6 check, take, and I can go knight c4. So yeah, unfortunately, take, knight e3 check, and knight f5. Yeah, so unfortunately, if you go into this line, I mean, with only 2 isolated pawns left for white, it's too drawish, even though you're up the exchange, but it's for those 2 pawns. Okay, so h5 was played. I said black eyes the h4 push. Yeah, I have a student who loves to play h4 prophylactic moves in this kind of a position, and I would agree, h4 is the best move. Actually, in the Berlin, I showed him an example of that, of an h5 move for black and an h4 move for white. He said, oh, that's one of my favorite prophylactic examples. So the other thing that could have been played was this. Remember, we're talking about getting in these breaks, and f5. And I said, in retrospect, this would have given Gukesh the best winning chances. Yeah, I mean, he might not have wanted to go into this, but now, finally, there's this move of knight takes c2. That rook there. Take, check, and then take. Yeah, equal material. So, yeah, I agree. I think h4 is the best move, like I was talking about. Now, I did hear somebody say that the computer said white says, you know, white is better. Not really. Again, you always have to play out more moves. I mean, I know it was a strong GM who said that, but you got to play out more moves. And what you can actually see is like, no, there's really nothing happening here. I mean, because again, all we do is, yeah, it is a maneuver. It is a long maneuver from f6 all the way to e6, but you know what? Nothing. White's not really doing that much in the meantime either. So I like this little move, f4. Take. Rook d3. Yeah, it's just super drawish. So that is only a draw there. But I still liked the idea of h4, and I think the computer initially overrates it, but that's exactly why you have to play out moves. And in your game analysis, too, you got to do the same thing. All right, so knight e2, knight c6, knight c3. I said Ding stays true to his strategy of avoiding penetration. He doesn't want to let the rook come in. Yeah, really not a whole lot of ideas for it to play tactically. Yeah, the other consideration is like, what about taking and then h4 and knight h5? A consideration, but you know, knight just comes over here. Knight e3. Yeah, I'm just hopping around with the knights. Nothing really happening. All the squares are controlled. So these doubled pawns are not bad. They're guarding squares. Everything's controlled. Very, very equal. So knight d4. Yeah, and if h4, knight h7, same line as before. Engine's saying plus equal here. They're wrong. There's no advantage. Like I said, the knight just comes here. There's no problem whatsoever for black. Again, this is why you always have to verbalize. If you're actually better, say why. Because if the computer says 0.3 and you can't actually give a real reason, you're like, well, I have slightly better positioned knights. It's like, do you really? Not really. So, I mean, I knew a GM. Even a GM would sometimes do this. He'd be like, you know, he'd see 0.3 on the computer, and then he'd come up with some sort of fake explanation, which he knew wasn't a real explanation. And it's like, don't do that. Look, if you're 2,500, you don't need to do that. What you really need to do is you need to say, okay, well, like, for example, what would be an argument in terms of having, let's say, a better bishop, for example? He'd say, well, I'm better because I have a better bishop and I can use it to do something. So it's about utility. If I'm going to say that white is better because of the knights, well, do I have a stable knight outpost? Not really. After the line with knight d5, I was playing c6 anyway, so there's really nothing there in any case. But yeah, knight e2, knight c6, knight c3, he just repeated. Knight d4. Black was content with the draw because he had so few prospects to be better. Even if h4 comes in, white is rock solid and black has no clear targets to attack. So I actually thought this was a pretty well-played game by both sides. I didn't think either side really kind of played in a pointless way like some people might think. Some people might go, oh, that was boring, nothing really happened. But if you kind of look at the interesting moments, I mean, it's like, well, white got a little bit more space. White potentially had some interesting prospects, some interesting pawn sacks, tempting black. I mean, you really only have two things you can go for as white in this type of a position. You're probably not going to get an objective advantage, but you could get a time advantage and you could also get a familiarity advantage. So if you're up 20 minutes on the clock and you're more comfortable with the position, that might be ideal preparation in a world championship match like this. Also keep in mind he did get to keep a bunch of pieces on the board. So I thought it was very interesting what he did, and I think black was very principled. Just kind of stuck to his guns and played very aggressively himself. Knight d4 and rook d6 and g6. Notice how nearly every single thing black did to counter white's purposeful ideas was purposeful himself. So when you consider that, it's sort of like, yeah, I mean, both sides played a very good game. And you'll notice in my analysis, actually, I did not even put a single dubious mark on a single move. So by my definition of a perfect game, this was a perfect game. There were no dubious moves. And by that I mean there was not a single move that the computer could really make a compelling case that there was a significantly stronger option. Interestingly, really for either side, as we can see when we look through the moves here. So for either side, there wasn't really anything. I mean, there were just a couple of ideas I had for black. Like I said, instead of g6, I was giving g5, g4, a little bit more aggressive. Still ends in equality, but so you can't prove it to a computer that g5 is better. But it's a little bit more aggressive. And I preferred a couple of the other options like h5, h4, and trying to go through with the breaks. And I also said that white should have played h4 just for practical reasons. Just because if you can deny your opponent what they want to play, that tends to be a good idea to go for. But as you can see in my line here, a computer saying plus equal here is wrong. Got to play it out. Always got to play out these moves. And as you can see, there's really nothing here. I mean, and also just keep in mind, all of black's pieces are really excellently placed. And, I mean, if you have no real weaknesses being attacked, no real targets being attacked, I mean, the isolated e5 pawn not being attacked, c5 not being attacked, and all the remaining pieces are active, I mean, you're probably not going to be worse, especially in an ending like this. Because you have to ask yourself, well, what are they going for? I mean, your king is obviously safe, your piece activity and coordination is great, and your weaknesses are not exploitable. So that's important for how you consider weaknesses. But I thought all things considered, Ding did a good job in this game, and Gukesh also did a good job in this game. So it was not a bad World Championship game. And I will say, if you were playing with either color against a 1900 player or a 2000 player, and you were within that playing strength or stronger, of course, there are plenty of winning chances from both sides of the board. So there were lots of as we discussed, there were lots of little moments where a different plan could have been tried. Like I said, the pawn sack for white, knight e1. I mean, that would have been the third possible moment where a pawn could have been sacrificed, and maybe you play that in a real game and people panic and, your knight comes to c7 and, maybe potentially you're a tiny bit better here, just a tiny bit better here, and the opponent's low on time and you get a good chance to squeeze him. But going to be very curious what Ding will try in the next white game. My guess is you'll probably see exactly what we typically see throughout these matches. A little bit of e4, a little bit of d4, maybe knight f3. There might be a ready in one of the games. We'll see. But I think we're going to see very principled e4 and very principled d4 from both players. I think next game Ding will return to d4 and we'll see what he's got. I'm really curious what he's going to consider to be the most critical thing that he doesn't want to face when he plays d4. You know, on some level, people often say, "Oh, it's the semi-Slav," because they've worked that out so deeply. But a lot of people are a bit uncomfortable with going so deep into those lines. So, might not be a semi-Slav. Might actually not be a semi-Slav. What we might actually see could just be Queen's Gambit declined, Tartakower. Could just be Nimzo Tartakower repertoire. Very, very common. If you haven't seen my video, The Best Defense to D4, I would check that one out on the Nimzo. But yeah, both of these guys have played the Nimzo quite a bit with black. So maybe we'll get an interesting Nimzo game. We'll have to see. All right, well, have a great night or day wherever you are, and I'll catch you in the next one.